Hey everyone, this is Pete, and welcome back to the 400 Mini show, an exploration of the built-in games for the 400 Mini retro gaming console, and onwards into the broader library of Atari 8-bit games. Today's game is Battlezone, a title with its origins in the arcades of 1980. That arcade original was a pioneer in numerous ways, most significantly the way that it used vector graphics to draw polygonal 3D objects, and how it unfolded from a first-person perspective. Battlezone was designed by Ed Rotberg, who drew inspiration from Atari's 1974 game Tank. Some also draw comparisons to a first-person perspective tank game known as Panther on the Plato Academic system, but Rotberg claimed he had never played the game prior to designing Battlezone. The Atari 8-bit version of Battlezone came out extremely late. It didn't hit the North American market until 1987 alongside the Atari XE game system, a consoleized version of the Atari 65XE that included a detachable keyboard and full compatibility with all Atari 8-bit software and peripherals. It took even longer for it to make it across the pond and appeared with little to no fanfare whatsoever, which was very much the norm for Atari UK's marketing, or lack thereof, at the time. Reviewing the XEGS cartridge in the December-January 1990 issue 47 of Page 6 Publishing's New Atari User, regular contributor Paul Rickson commented on the dated appearance of Battlezone's Atari 8-bit port, drawing unfavourable comparisons to Novagen Software's excellent Encounter, which had released back in 1984. The use of standard graphics modes and default text styles gives Battlezone a rather amateurish feel by modern day standards, Rickson wrote, but I can't deny that the underlying game is exceedingly and truly addictive. How well does it stand up 34 years after that review though? Let's find out. Let's go play Battlezone.
Okay, welcome back to the 400 Mini, where today we're taking a look at Battlezone. In this strategic shoot-em-up, it is your mission to save the world by outmaneuvering and destroying rebel super tanks and UFOs. Enemy tanks will recharge before shooting again. Use your scanner to locate enemies out of view. 5 skill level challenges. Keep moving to avoid enemy fire. Let's just check the controls. So movement is just on the stick, with the fire button on the fire button or shoulder button, and select difficulty level is on the menu button. Simple enough. Alright. Let's begin. Atari Corporation presents Battlezone. Copyright 1987 Atari. All rights reserved. Yeah, so this was a very, very late version of Battlezone. And to be honest, I mean, it's not terrible. It's not terrible by any means, and it's a valiant effort to do the vector graphics thing in the style of the arcade game. But as Paul Rickson said in his review in Page 6 in 1990, Battlezone had already been kind of superseded by this point, because Novagen Software's Encounter came out in 1984 and was amazing. It didn't use vector graphics, no, but it did a convincing 3D effect using raster-style graphics, which arguably work a lot better on a traditional TV display. And it was high speed, it's smoother than this, it's got more variety than this. And it's just generally a better game. But that said, I don't think we should discount Battlezone completely on Atari 8-bit, because what you have to remember is that polygonal 3D graphics were still kind of in their infancy throughout the 1980s. Yes, the 16-bit platforms were starting to do more adventurous and exciting things with filled-in 3D. But it was always quite impressive to see wireframe 3D graphics running on an 8-bit platform. That's why one of the reasons why things like David Braben's Elite is so well regarded on the platforms that it came out on, or the 8-bit platforms it came out on, I should say. It was arguably less impressive and not quite as good a game on the 16-bit platforms for various reasons. In my opinion anyway. I don't like the ST version of Elite very much. Oh, we've got a saucer or something somewhere. Doesn't appear to be on the radar though. Anyway, yes, if you've never played Battlezone before, I mean it's hopefully fairly self-explanatory from what I'm doing. You drive a tank from a first-person perspective. In the original arcade game, you had 2 joysticks that each controlled the left and right treads on your tank. Whereas here on the Atari 8-bit, we just used a single joystick to just move forwards, backwards, left and right. So we've probably got slightly less manoeuvrability in this Atari 8-bit version. But you certainly don't miss the second joystick. In fact, if anything, playing with the 2 joysticks is very confusing if you've never played a game like that before. So, in order to locate the enemy tanks, you have a radar at the top of the screen, as you can see. And there's also a text description appears telling you whether the enemy is to your left or to the right. And you use that to help you find the enemies and destroy them before they destroy you, preferably. Now we're playing on the default difficulty level here. Oh dear. Oh, that was a bad time to cough, wasn't it? We're playing on the default difficulty level here, which is quite easy, as you can see. The enemy tanks aren't really shooting at us, so the only real threat is from those occasional missiles. Like this thing, that come flying towards you, and you have to... Whoops! You have to destroy them before they hit you. And the tricky thing with those is that you can only have one shell out at once. So if you fire a shot and it misses, you've got to wait for it to hit something or dissipate before you can fire another one. And so accuracy is really key in this game. Oh, they're actually starting to shoot at us now. Oh, and they dodge. That's not very nice. Yeah, they're very hard to hit once they start dodging. Game over. Start begins game. Option sets level. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different levels to play at. Let's have a go at level 5. See how much harder that is from the beginning. Right, so immediately we start off seeing the other type of tanks, which I think are slightly faster and more manoeuvrable. We're right in with a missile, although they don't dodge just yet. Well, there's a saucer. But we're facing a saucer and a tank at the same time. Saucer's quite hard to hit, as you can probably see. But on level 5, we're scoring much higher. So we get much more points per target than we were on level 1. So if you want to get a high score in Battlezone, play on the higher difficulty levels. But, of course, you're also, excuse me, at greater risk of being shot. And yeah, that's basically everything there is to this game. You drive, you shoot, you try and dodge, you get hit by missiles. Right, so I think what we want to do is we want to wait until this dude is almost on top of us before we shoot. But yeah, the other thing Encounter had, which this doesn't have, is you had the ability to shoot more rapidly in Encounter, which made the enemy encounters a little bit more fair. So you still had the high-speed missiles that avoided your shots in Encounter, but because you could fire more than one shot at once, it was a lot easier to hit them than it is here. Ah, okay. So, actually a decent strategy for them seems to be actually driving towards them and shooting. Is that way they don't have as much time to respond to your shots. But it's risky. In the background we can see Battlezone's famous volcano, which is erupting. That was apparently added at the suggestion of Owen Rubin, who made a number of other games for Atari, including some vector games. I think he did Major Havoc, if I remember rightly. Apparently the erupting volcano was an effect that was added at the suggestion of Owen Rubin. Right, let's have another go on level 5, because I actually think it's a lot more fun at that harder difficulty level. Because on level 1, it's too easy for too long. Whereas level 5, we're right in with a reasonable challenge level. Right, head towards it. There we go. Enemy in range to right. Oh! Didn't even see the shot there. Yeah, that is the other issue with this. Because this isn't using a fancy vector monitor and is instead doing an approximation of vector graphics using raster graphics, sometimes details can be lost when there's several objects overlapping on the screen. It can be a little bit tricky to see exactly what's going on. So that's a bit of a problem when you're trying to avoid the shots that the tanks are making. It's quite difficult to see when one is actually fired at you. So I guess you need to make decent use of the sound cues. That was not making good use of the sound cues. That was getting shot. Nope, well, my strategy didn't work there. That is most unfortunate. You're a speedy little blighter, aren't you? Don't. Yeah, I think you could maybe debate as to whether or not this is really using vector graphics or if it's just using sort of techniques that look like vector graphics. Because if you look at the tanks in particular, their models don't seem to rotate smoothly. They seem to just have several sort of preset positions that they appear in. So it's entirely possible that they're sort of faking it with sprites. But at the same time, if you look at the objects that are littering the landscape, you can see them from several different angles as you pass by them. So I mean, ultimately, I guess it doesn't really matter really, because the effect is still quite convincing. Whoops. I think it's also worth noting that despite Battlezone being typically described as a 3D game, it's not really 3D, because there's no up and down. There's no up and down. However, it is tracking your position, including stuff that isn't visible on screen. You'll see that sometimes I reverse into things and it says blocked, because I'm trying to reverse through an object that is behind me. So it is tracking off-screen position of objects, which is cool. Whenever I played a game like this as a kid, I always found myself wondering what would happen if you picked a direction and just kept going. I mean, obviously now I know the answer is nothing. Nothing. You would just keep seeing more and more objects generated in the landscape, because it's designed to just endlessly repeat. But when I was a kid, a game like this gave me a really cool feeling of actually sort of being in a game world that was very much unlike 2D games at the time. Even though I couldn't do it, I wanted to explore these worlds. And it kind of stoked my imagination somewhat. It made me think, well, what if there's something over the horizon? It's that old cliche, isn't it? What if you could go to that mountain in the background? And these days, of course, you can. So much so that it's become a running joke that you see that mountain over there, you can actually go to it. It has become a meme. But back when this came out, you couldn't go to that mountain. You could see that mountain, but no, you couldn't go to it. You couldn't drive over the horizon. The horizon was always out of reach. That's why old racing games are sometimes called horizon chasers. Oh dear. Oh dear. Because in those games, you are constantly chasing the horizon. It never gets any closer. You never get to your destination in those games. How do we destroy these sources? Oh, like that. So yeah, this is not a terrible game for the Atari 8-bit, but when it released, it was already very dated. It was already superseded by games that did the same thing but better. And there's just not a lot to it. Which by 1987 people were starting to expect a little bit more from their video games. There was still a place for arcade style stuff, just as there is still a place for arcade style stuff today. But yeah, this was quite rightly, I think, seen as a bit primitive compared to other stuff that was available at the time. And other stuff that had been available for several years at this point. Now, the aforementioned Encounter had been around for so long that it had been through the entire cycle of releasing at full price in 1984 and then getting later budget re-release So to put that in perspective, the XE Game System cartridge for this cost £14.95 in 1987. Encounter, meanwhile, you could get for probably £2.99. On cassette, admittedly, which was a bit of a liability on the Atari 8-bit because cassette loading on the Atari 8-bit was a nightmare. Because unlike rival platforms, you weren't talking just like 5 minutes to load a game from cassette on the Atari. You were talking 15, 20, even more minutes sometimes. I can't destroy these. I just cannot get those. So, let's find... No. Not happening. Yeah, so for your £2.99 you had the inconvenience of loading from cassette. But there were ways around that. There were tools such as Transdisk, which allowed you to convert cassette-based games to disc-based games, which were very popular. And these days, of course, you don't really have to worry about that because you can just load stuff onto a flash cart or a disk drive emulator, or even the disk drives are fairly reasonably readily accessible on the second-hand market these days, although you will probably have to do a little bit of maintenance on them. And if you're running on an emulator or a device like the 400 Mini that we've got here, you just pick the game, start it up and play it. That's it. You don't have to worry about that. And so in that context, sure, boot this up out of curiosity to get a look at what is at heart a decent quality arcade port, but then go and play Encounter instead because it's just better. But yeah, this was a valiant effort. I think if it had come out much earlier, then it could have been a hit. And what I suspect happened, going by the dates, is that this was probably a casualty of Atari's difficulties between 1983 and 1987. The same thing that caused the Atari 7800 to be delayed from 1984 to 1987. I suspect this game was probably put together a lot earlier and just wasn't released because Atari was in such a mess for several years. Particularly the 8-bit side of things. You are being very annoying, mister. Stand still! Jesus! There we go. That was satisfying. Yeah, so I don't know 100% for sure, but I suspect that's what happened with this. This was probably supposed to come out in 1984 and didn't, because Jack Trammell was busy restructuring the company at the time, and that meant a lot of projects, particularly gaming related projects, went by the wayside because he wanted to, among other things, place a lot of his focus on the Atari ST when that came out in 1985. Anyway, I think that's probably enough Battlezone for one day. You've got the idea of how that plays. It's not bad. It's not terrible. It's not amazing. I think I think that's the best thing we can say about it, really. It's certainly not an unwelcome inclusion on the 400 Mini. Let's put it that way. But given the choice, I would rather play something else. Given the choice, I would rather play something else. There are much better games on the Atari 8-bit. There are much better first-person tank-based games on the Atari 8-bit, as we've talked about. But as it stands, this is an interesting historical curiosity for various reasons. And there we go. Now we've taken a look at it. So it just remains for me to say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.